Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. More about them in just a moment.
To get a man's soul and give him nothing in return. That is what really gladdens the devil's heart. Why is it that people are capable of such evil? From the atrocities of the past to that person who insulted you at work last week, humanity seems to have a surprising affinity for cruelty. We are often unkind, uncaring, and capricious even when it doesn't seem to benefit us at all. What's more, sometimes this behavior comes from someone you least expect. Sometimes you see a warm-hearted, generous, and virtuous individual degrade into brutality before your very eyes. Sometimes that person is us. And one of the most insightful examinations of this everyday evil comes in C.S. Lewis's novel, The Screwtape Letters. Here, he details a demon's advice for turning a man away from God and goodness and towards vice and cruelty. But even if, like me, you don't believe in God, it is still a brilliant examination of how we can slowly move from sticking by our values to becoming something we despise. Get ready to learn how we are closer to evil than we thought, why we should beware of thinking of ourselves too often, and how we all have a near infinite capacity for self-deception. As always, there is much more to this book than I could cover here, and I will be looking at it specifically from a secular perspective, despite Lewis being a Christian author. But before any of that, I want to take a brief moment to thank our very kind sponsor, Squarespace. If you've ever built a website, then you know it can be a bit of a nightmare. First, you have to choose the domain and then get stuck into the design. And most of us aren't web designers, so there's always this little voice telling us that we're probably messing it all up anyway. But this is where Squarespace is incredibly helpful. They compress all of that into a single site, and their ready-made templates reassure you that you are building a website that works. I'm almost done using it to make my own website, and it saves me countless hours by streamlining the whole process, which is pretty handy because I'm often quite short on time. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a domain name or a website. But anyway, back to evil. 1. Ignorance is bliss, for now. John Stuart Mill once said that all it would take for evil people to achieve their aims would be that good people should look on and do nothing about it. The thought behind this is that often when a grand moral disaster occurs, there is only a small minority of the population actually committing the atrocity. But it is almost always passively enabled by the majority who refuse to do anything about it. The same sentiment was expressed by Edmund Burke when he said that an organised few will tend to prevail over a disorganised many, provided that the many don't pull themselves together incredibly quickly. So it is telling that Screwtape's first piece of advice towards his villainous protégé, Wormwood, is to try to distract his victim's mind from even thinking about what is right or wrong. Interestingly, Screwtape concedes that most people will find moral reasoning pretty persuasive. He echoes Tolstoy's thought that most of us have a general idea of what is right or wrong 90% of the time, since most of us aren't walking about the world finding interesting philosophical ethical edge cases. I'm not sure whether this is true, but if it is, Screwtape says it's not even much of a disadvantage to the demons. Because while they may not be able to convince a human that a particular moral claim is incorrect, they will almost certainly be able to show them that it is in some way irrelevant. Screwtape observes how many people are not so concerned with the outright truth or falsity of the propositions we believe. But we are just as interested in whether they are considered forward-thinking or clever or modern or the future, or alternatively, echoing some grand design of the past. Either way, we are often drawn to ideas because of their utility or their dignity, rather than because we have a rational reason to believe them. Thus, he advises Wormwood to plant the thought in his victim's head that concerns of morality or God or ethics are in some way not real. They are too abstract to be of any practical significance. Screwtape says that on no account should the patient be allowed to dwell on what is right or wrong or an issue of principle. Instead, they should remain entirely concerned with the practical, that is, what's in front of them at that very moment. If they do end up thinking on some ethical or theological matter, then Wormwood should try to distract them from it immediately by resting their mind back to what they're going to have for lunch, or the present concerns of that afternoon's meetings. The idea is to promote a general sense of apathy about anything to do with values. The human may say they have principles, but in truth, these are so disconnected from their actions that they may as well not be there. The realm of what is right and what is actual are kept far away from one another. Put a pin in this thought, as we'll be revisiting it in detail later in the video. Generally, the thought behind this and many of Screwtape's other machinations is to ensure that the human never becomes too attached to an ethical position. In effect, they become a sort of moral nihilist, though without ever consciously adopting that view. Again, they need not be convinced against their morals, but simply have their minds drawn away from them, time after time, especially when there is practical difficulty in sticking with them. The reasoning here is pretty simple. The further concerns about what is right or wrong recede into the distance, the easier other things can take their place. According to Screwtape, this is a pretty straightforward task, because we're honestly not all that keen on strict value systems in the first place. Take a true, thoroughgoing belief in the Christian God. There are a whole host of commands given that are overwhelming in their demands. Give all you can to the poor, pick up your cross and follow him, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I'm not the first to point out that what is technically required of a Christian is something approaching superhuman. Secular ethics is no less extreme. A utilitarian, ideally, learns not to prioritize themselves or their loved ones above anyone else, and sees all people as equally relevant in their decisions. This is all well and good in theory, but in practice it means that we should not value our own family over a stranger on the other side of the planet. As Peter Singer has pointed out, pure utilitarians should also donate most of their income, and even a kidney, to those who would take more pleasure in them. And Screwtape is thrilled with the extremity of these moral demands, because it makes it relatively easy to convince us that our value should be subsumed to a nebulously defined practicality. Or, as he puts it, the humans themselves do not desire God as much as they suppose. There's such a thing as getting more than they bargained for. I find this point really interesting, because, if I'm being truthful, it definitely sometimes applies to me. Like most people, I enjoy thinking of myself as relatively principled and wanting, broadly speaking, to be as kind as possible. But I can remember numerous occasions over the past few months where I have been far less kind than I could have been just because of how I was feeling at the time. Hell, just the other day I was in a bad mood and I let it turn me into a grumpy bastard for the better part of an afternoon. Where were my precious values then? Not necessarily abandoned, but conveniently forgotten about when things got difficult. A sort of passive, semi-conscious cynicism. Although Lewis here is primarily talking about how we can forget our relationship with God due to the concerns of the material world, I think it has a far broader application than that. Oftentimes, even unconsciously, we allow ourselves to think that the values that we hold are in some way not real or are merely theoretical. A luxury to be abandoned when we have settled back into how things really are, or the real world. And sometimes this may be true. I'm a big fan of Aristotle's notion of practical wisdom. But Lewis reminds us not to give these up too easily. We non-believers may not have to fear the fires of hell, but breach our own values one too many times, and our conscience may torture us more than we thought possible, as we morph into something that we no longer recognize. And this is far from the only weapon in Screwtape and Wormwood's arsenal. The next comes with a disturbing reminder of just how vulnerable our wills are to changing circumstance. 2. With friends like these. Despite the emphasis Christianity generally places on human free will and the ultimate sovereignty of the soul, Lewis spends a lot of time in the Screwtape Letters talking about the importance of someone's social circle and environment for capturing their mind and damning them to hell. One of the very first lines of the novel is Screwtape expressing his approval that the patient is spending time with his materialist friend. But this is only one way Screwtape and Wormwood use the company their victim keeps to stray him from his intended path. Next, the demons ensure the patient falls in with a group of high society thinkers, people who consider themselves sophisticants. The man understandably wants to impress these new friends, and so begins to parrot whatever they say. When they encourage a position he finds morally abhorrent, he just nods along, or hedges his bets by signaling his agreement without outright saying anything. Screwtape ultimately wants him to develop a sort of split personality. He will mouth along to the prayers in church and consider himself a good Christian ethicist, but the very next day he will scorn those same principles at dinner with his new socialite circle. He hopes the man will eventually take pride in this paradox, saying that it marks him out as a skillful and charismatic person. A social butterfly able to navigate different circles to his heart's content. All of this will help set up a very useful state of mind for the demons. A mixture of self-assured righteousness and profound hypocrisy. On the one hand, the victim can call himself a good person, but on the other, all of his habits will slowly turn away from his principles and towards whatever is most socially expedient at the time. This should take place so slowly that the man will not even feel it happening, until one day he finds he doesn't even know what he believes is right or wrong anymore, but only what is useful to him at the time. He becomes a sort of moral Machiavellian, and as it is often more expedient to be cruel than kind, it is child's play to turn him to brutality. Here again, we see this link between apathy towards values and making cruelty the path of least resistance. Screwtape says that one of the greatest states of mind a demon can inculcate in their unsuspecting victim is flippancy. That is, the refusal to treat any matter, moral or otherwise, with any kind of seriousness or commitment. He wants the patient to become so immersed in irony that he forgets what he believes and stops caring about the truth entirely. Every serious suggestion becomes a joke, an opportunity to show how clever you are. Under such circumstances, commitment to any kind of value system becomes borderline impossible. To lay your cards on the table and say, "This is what I believe," would be to make yourself vulnerable to criticism. So, rather than risk social condemnation, flippancy encourages people to not believe anything at all, to become moral vacuums, all while thinking they're being extraordinarily clever. Screwtape and Wormwood hope to fill that vacuum with whatever they please. Thus, that passive cynicism we talked about in the previous section is slowly transformed into an active one. Perhaps most distressingly, just because we are in good company does not necessarily mean we are safe. At one point, the victim falls in with a crowd of very kind-hearted folks, upright in their morals, steadfast in their faith, and selfless in their love. But Screwtape says this is a marvelous opportunity to encourage a kind of prideful self-righteousness in the patient. Rather than see how these people alert him to his own flaws, the man is guided towards thinking that because he is in their company, he must be just as good and kind as they are. Instead of emulating their qualities, he is encouraged to look on anyone outside their inner circle with derision. Thus, far from finding a motive for selfless kindness and generosity, the man would instead stoke division and hatred. According to Screwtape, the axiom of hell is that of self-concern and zero-sum happiness. That is, the twin propositions of "I am concerned with me, you are concerned with you," and "whatever I have, you cannot have." This is a classic bit of C.S. Lewis thinking, where pride is considered not so much as outright self-aggrandizement, but instead as simply thinking about yourself too much, in any capacity. And this makes sense because the through line of how the demons use social connections to gradually erode the victim's own values is to always use them to encourage some form of division or selfishness. Rather than being patient with his mother's suffering, the man sees her as short-tempered and demanding. Rather than the company of people he admires making him humble, it causes him to condescend to those outside his precious inner circle. He even lets his high society friends split his mind in two, turning him against himself and sowing internal division to match the external. And I think there is something very interesting about the way Lewis places such importance on the company we keep. We do often turn to others to give us signals of how we should behave, and so there's a strong argument for being very wary of who we spend time around, especially if we find they are slowly turning us crueler and less kind. If Aristotle praised friendships of virtue because they could make us better, then it might be worth us bewaring friendships of vice, and especially the kind of casual flippancy that will turn us in circles until we are not even sure what we sincerely believe anymore. I'm not judging, I've certainly been there, and by there I partly mean Twitter. On the other hand, Lewis shows that with a certain approach, we can make even friendships of virtue something that encourages our worst instincts. It's not that controversial to point out that a sense of superiority to one's fellow man has been a key component in some of the greatest atrocities in history, and an awful lot of mundane evil as well. Self-righteousness has allowed people to do horrible things and still emerge with the idea that they are somehow good people or the right sort. In such a situation, we may not even realize how much we've betrayed ourselves and others, all for the sake of our false ideas of superiority. And I want to pursue this point a step further, because Screwtape makes some excellent observations about how we can fool ourselves into thinking that we are still sticking by our value systems, even when we haven't acted upon them for years. 3. Fantasy and will. In his Confessions, St. Augustine often talks about wickedness as if it was a form of ignorance. He outlines how his life before conversion was full of illusory pleasures, but that he was denied any real sense of fulfillment. Compared to his later theological glory, he truly saw this as nothing. And I think this touches upon a theme that C.S. Lewis is very fond of in the Screwtape Letters: the role of fantasy and delusion in stoking cruelty and warding off kindness. In one of his letters, Screwtape explains that there are 3 parts to a human: the fantasy, the intellect, and the will. This maps quite nicely onto the old Stoic division between originating an idea, believing it, and knowing it as a foundation for action. A large proportion of Screwtape's advice is centered around ensuring the man never lets anything good leave the realm of fantasy, while the cruel, the petty, and the unkind dominate the will itself. For instance, the man should fantasize extensively about doing good. Perhaps one day he will become a great spiritual leader or solve an overwhelming social problem. He may say he'll leave everything to charity when he dies, or tell himself that one day he'll be perfect in his conduct. The 2 essential ingredients is that it must be very far into the future and also potentially unachievable. At the same time, it must be vivid enough to capture the victim's imagination so that the fantasy almost seems like it's real. The dangerous thing about imagination is that a very detailed bit of fantasy can be so convincing that it feels almost like we've already achieved our aim. We can give ourselves a pat on the back, knowing that we are destined for phenomenal things, and any worry about our own inner goodness vanishes. After all, we have such pure thoughts, our aims are perfectly noble. How could we fail to be good? On the other hand, in the world outside of fantasy, Screwtape advises that the victim be led into foul temper and resentment. His pride should be inflamed so that his kindness ceases to be generous but instead becomes transactional. He must become convinced of his intellect, so he looks down on the opinions of others. Each time he snaps at his mother or his partner or his friend, he must be immediately presented with a justification as to how they definitely deserved it, and that this was only a rare exception to his otherwise kind and caring disposition. Let him soothe himself by again imagining that he has already done immense good for the world, or certainly will do in future. What are 1,000 trivial brutalities against the grandeur of his benevolent fantasies? This is a true piece of malevolent genius by Screwtape. It recognizes that we will twist ourselves in knots to remain convinced of our fundamental goodness, even when there is very little physical evidence that it exists. What he wants is for us to imagine that we are being kind deep down, even when we are cruel to those around us. The grandiose scope of our moral fantasies means that we lose sight of the everyday unkindness that we enact. The fact that we snapped at someone in a shop, or were short with a friend, or failed to stop and help someone in need no longer seems particularly important. This view places the ideas of good and evil so far beyond the realm of our day-to-day lives that it almost renders them theoretical and thus inert. We lose sight of the ancient Greek idea that our virtues are fundamentally enacted, and so we do not notice our persistent, mundane horror. It's a great combination for the demons because the fantasies discourage the victim from reflecting on their life and realizing what they're doing. This could precipitate guilt and regret, and, subsequently, change. Instead, they use their intellect to rationalize when they are cruel, and their fantasies to imagine when they are kind. According to Screwtape, if they ever do have a light bulb moment, most people are liable to go straight from self-righteousness to despair. They have believed that they were a good person for so long and then discovered it false, so they may just leap to the opposite extreme. Like Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, they will decide it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And they start to think they are too far gone to ever change their ways. Then there will be nothing left for them to do but embrace their own cruelty. At least, that is the elder demon's theory. I love this idea from Lewis because many philosophical studies on evil focus on the grand atrocities. Hannah Arendt asks how someone could be a fascist administrator. Camus wants to know how Robespierre could enact his reign of terror. And Dostoevsky asks what could drive a man to murder. But Lewis is not so much concerned with this, but instead a more recognizable and everyday kind of evil. The sort of unkindness that any of us have the opportunity to enact and become. In a fascinating passage, Screwtape emphasizes that it does not matter to him whether someone is damned to hell by impressive sins or by a multitude of miniature malevolences. They all end up in the same place. But even if you're not a believer, by placing the discussion about good and evil in the mouths of these eternal demons, Lewis abstracts away from the scale of the badness. He casts Attila the Hun and your colleague who makes everyone else's life a misery in the same role, with only contingent circumstances separating them. And I find this a fascinating point for personal reflection. As I said in the first section, it is very easy to think of ethical concerns as totally separate from the demands of everyday life. To imagine good and evil battling it out between great leaders and powerful spirits. But Lewis reminds us of something we often try to forget. Our tiny cruelties are just as real as the monsters that pave the road of history. It's simply a matter of scale. And to paraphrase Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil cuts through every man's heart. So I think it may be worth us asking, are we really as good as we think we are? Or have we allowed our kindness to become much more theoretical than practical, while our wills indulge themselves in tiny evils each and every day? But finally, Lewis ends the Screwtape Letters on an incredibly hopeful note, but also one that raises profound questions for people like myself who do not believe in a benevolent God. 4. Modern-day redemption. The final letter Screwtape writes to Wormwood is full of anger and spite. He chastises Wormwood for having let the mind of their victim pass through their fingers. He has fallen under the protection of God now, and nothing they can possibly do will ever get to him. It is, quite literally, a Deus Ex Machina ending, and that is sort of the point. Lewis wants to emphasize the idea that it is through the grace of God that people are saved and can resist temptation. But despite this, he provides endless food for thought for those of us who are non-believers as well. The first message that Lewis effectively argues for is that it is never too late to be saved, or, in secular terms, to change our course. This is also reflected in his other great work on salvation and damnation, The Great Divorce. It may be painful to come to the realization of our everyday evils, but at the same time, this is the first step to changing them. While Lewis emphasizes the harm of ordinary malevolence by placing the discussion in the realm of eternal demons and heaven and hell, by the same token, he raises the stakes of everyday goodness. The man now under the protection of God has not done any of those great deeds he was encouraged to fantasize about. He simply tries to embody a commonplace sort of kindness, praying for his daily bread and the strength to remain good for the coming hours. He has become a fantastic blend of normality and saintliness. Whereas before he was a reflection of all of those little cruelties we encounter on a day-to-day basis, now he is instead a representation of ordinary kindness. He is the person who gives you their used rail pass on the tube, or the stranger that stops to ask if you're okay on the street. He is the friend that cheers you up after a bad day, and the guy at a new job who just manages to make you feel welcome. Just as the road to hell is a series of tiny sins, the road to heaven is painted as a collection of humble virtues. I think this is an immensely encouraging note for Lewis to end on, and it is the perfect counterpoint to the previous discussion of the impact of ordinary evil. But it's undeniable. God features very heavily in the way Lewis explains everyday goodness. So what do us non-believers do? Interestingly enough, this mirrors a debate in the early Christian church. The 4th century philosopher and theologian Pelagius once argued that humanity could achieve perfection without the direct grace of God, purely through the sovereignty of their own free will. In the early church, this became known as the Pelagian heresy. Principally, it was criticized by St. Augustine, who held that it was only through divine grace that humans can achieve anything close to moral perfection. And this reflects a general debate in early Christianity that is worth some reflection. When is someone redeemed of their sin? When are they forgiven? And how can we help someone become better, whatever we decide to mean by that? Now, I am primarily interested in this question from a non-theistic perspective. For a very long time in Europe, various churches had established their own doctrines on the forgiveness of sins, and Lewis is very much in that tradition where he says if someone truly repents, then God would want them to forget their sins, as if they had never happened, the slate truly wiped clean. But how are we going to deal with these issues in an increasingly secular world? Since none of us are perfect moral beings, we will all require forgiveness at some point. But where is this going to come from? From whence comes atheistic redemption? Well, Lewis has an interesting implicit suggestion in the Screwtape Letters. At numerous points, Screwtape says the one human behavior that demons simply cannot understand is love. But by love, he means this in the classic sense of wishing the good of the other for the sake of the other. This flies in the face of hell's axiom that whatever is yours and whatever is mine, and whatever you have, I cannot have, and vice versa. This sort of unexpectant magnanimity completely confuses Screwtape and the other denizens of hell because it is selflessness in its undistilled form. And this is lucky for the agnostics and atheists among us, because even if we do not believe in God, we can still strive for this state. Sure, we may not achieve it in its purest form, that would almost be superhuman. But this sort of other-directed concern is positioned as the antidote to the extreme self-concern that demons wish to create in their victims. All of Lewis's virtues, charity, forgiveness, kindness, humility, he thinks they all stem from this key ingredient, wishing the good of other people for their own benefit. He says this is how we might achieve that paradoxical state where we rejoice at the success of others just as much as our own, where we would not wish to be unkind to other people because it would be like punching ourselves in the face, where we wish to help others simply because we want what is best for them. Perhaps this is our route to everyday saintliness and an atheistic form of salvation. Interestingly, you see similar themes crop up both in Dostoevsky and in Camus, so it's a suggestion worth listening to. Lewis does not pretend that this would be easy either. All through the letters, there are examples where the man fools himself into thinking that he is being loving, when in fact all he desires is ownership or to puff up his own pride. For Lewis, developing a consistent, real concern for others is a long and arduous task, but one that we would do well to strive towards. If you're religious, then this could be because of rewards in a future life. But if you're not, it could simply be to encourage kindness and calm and serenity in this world. Imagine truly being able to take joy in the success of a stranger. It's not just in Christianity that you see this suggestion. It also crops up an awful lot in Buddhism with the notion of loving kindness, and is painted as a significant step on the road to enlightenment, and as a result, a worldly kind of peace. Of course, Lewis's particular suggestion is open to question and challenge, but I largely raise it because of the implications it has for an increasingly atheistic world. One of the reasons I spend a lot of time reading the works of religious thinkers is because for thousands of years, the topics of forgiveness, charity, and love were mainly approached from this perspective, and the figure of God inevitably looms large in their accounts. If we are going to learn to live without God, then it's worth taking up the mantle of these questions for ourselves, to have our own worked-out philosophies of redemption, forgiveness, other concern, and salvation. So, for my fellow non-believers in the audience, Lewis raises a fascinating question. What would an atheist version of the Screwtape Letters look like? And how would it differ from Lewis? I won't pretend to have the answer, but I do think it's a question well worth asking. But if you want more on C.S. Lewis's philosophy, then click here to learn how he thought civilization would slowly slide into disaster, led by a self-destructive philosophy. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.